The night my older brother got promoted to partner at his firm, my father called me from the restaurant before the dinner even started. "Just so you know," he said, "we're doing the toast early. Don't be late and make it awkward." I wasn't late. I was already in the parking lot when he called. I'd been sitting there for 10 minutes, trying to decide if the sport coat I was wearing looked too casual. My wife was in the passenger seat, telling me I looked fine. I told her I was fine. Neither of us believed the other. We went in anyway. My brother's name is Tanner. He's 3 years older than me, and he has always been exactly the kind of son my father wanted. Tanner went to Georgetown. Tanner clerked for a federal judge. Tanner made partner at 31, which apparently is some kind of record at his firm. My father has a framed photo of Tanner's law school graduation on his desk at home. Not his wedding, not the birth of his kids, his graduation. I teach 8th grade science at a public middle school in Tacoma, Washington. I have taught there for 6 years. Last year, 2 of my students won a regional science fair. One of them wants to study environmental engineering. The other one wants to work for NASA. I think about them sometimes when things get hard, and it helps. My father has never once asked me about my students. The dinner was at a steakhouse downtown. One of those places with dark wood paneling and white tablecloths and a sommelier who talks to you like you already know what he's going to say. My father had reserved a private dining room in the back. When my wife and I walked in, I counted maybe 30 people. Tanner's colleagues, a few law school friends, family friends I hadn't seen in years. My parents were already there. My mother hugged me. My father shook my hand. "You made it," he said. "I made it," I said. That was the whole conversation. We found seats at a table near the back of the room. Not the worst seats, but not close to the front either, where Tanner was sitting with the senior partners and their spouses. There were name cards. I noticed that before I sat down. Someone had arranged this deliberately. My wife noticed too. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand on mine under the table for a second and then let go. Her name is June. We met in grad school. She was getting her MBA, and I was getting my teaching certification, and we ended up in the same off-campus apartment complex. Our first real conversation was about whether the laundry machines on the second floor were better than the ones on the third floor. She had a whole theory. I thought she was the most interesting person I had ever talked to. We've been married 4 years. She runs corporate partnerships for a mid-sized nonprofit that funds STEM education programs in underfunded public schools across the Pacific Northwest. She is very good at her job. She works long hours, and she cares about what she does, and she is the kind of person who remembers the names of the custodians at every building she visits. I knew what her job was. What I didn't know, what she had kept deliberately quiet for reasons she would explain to me later, was exactly how large her organization had grown in the past 2 years. She had been cautious about talking about it at home. She said she didn't want me to feel like she was competing with me. I told her that was ridiculous. She said she knew, but still. I didn't push it. The toasts started before the entrees came out. Tanner's managing partner went first. He talked about Tanner's work ethic and his instincts and the Delacroix case, whatever that was, and the room laughed at the right moments and clinked glasses. Then a couple of colleagues went. Then an old law school friend told a story about a moot court competition that I guess was supposed to be funny. Everyone laughed. Then my father stood up. He's a tall man, my father. He was an attorney himself before he retired. Corporate litigation, 40 years. He has the kind of bearing that makes a room go quiet when he stands. He knows it, he has always known it. He talked about Tanner for about 5 minutes. He talked about watching him work through hard things and never complain. He talked about how proud he was. He said, Tanner was proof that if you set your sights on something and don't let anything distract you, there is nothing you cannot achieve. He paused there, and then he looked at me. It was quick, maybe 2 seconds, but it was deliberate. He looked directly at me and let that word hang in the air, distracted. And then he looked back at the room and smiled and raised his glass. I felt it in my chest like a stone dropping. June's hand found mine under the table again. After the toasts, my father made his way around the room. He stopped at every table. When he got to ours, he spent a few minutes talking to a couple of my mother's friends who were seated nearby. Then he looked at me and said pleasantly, "The way you say things when you want them to sound pleasant, how's the teaching going?" Not a question. The way he said it, it wasn't a question. "Good," I said. "Good," he said. And then he nodded, like that was the correct amount of conversation to have about my career, and moved on. One of the men at our table, someone I didn't recognize, leaned over after my father left and said, "What do you do?" I teach middle school science, I said. Oh, he said, and he turned back to his plate. I'm not going to pretend that didn't sting. It did. It always does. There's this particular kind of silence that follows when you tell people you're a teacher, and they've already decided what that means about you. I've had that silence follow me into family dinners and neighborhood parties and holiday gatherings for 6 years. I'm used to it in the way that you get used to a sore tooth. You don't stop noticing it, you just stop being surprised. The entrees came. The conversation at our table was pleasant enough. June was talking to the woman next to her about something. I was eating my steak and watching the front of the room where Tanner was holding court, laughing, easy in his skin, and my father was sitting beside him with the expression he gets when he's exactly where he wants to be. I thought about leaving, not dramatically, just quietly finishing my meal and making up an excuse about an early morning and going home. I'd done it before at these things. It's easier than staying until someone says something that takes a week to get out of your head, but June touched my arm. Wait, she said quietly, just that. I looked at her. She was looking at her phone. Then she put it face down on the table and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There's something happening, she said. In about 10 minutes. Just wait. What kind of something? She gave me a very small smile. The good kind. I didn't know what she meant. I found out later that she had gotten a text from her colleague, a woman named Dr. Osi. I knew her, we'd had dinner with her a couple of times, saying that the evening program was starting early. I still didn't know what that meant. I didn't connect it. What happened next is something I've replayed probably 100 times. One of the restaurant staff stepped to the front of the room and asked for everyone's attention. He explained that the firm was being honored tonight not only for Tanner's promotion, but for a partnership the firm had recently formed. A pro bono initiative with a regional nonprofit. He said the nonprofit would be making a brief acknowledgement. A woman walked to the front of the room. She was in her 40s, polished, the kind of presence that changes the air in a room when she enters it. I recognized her immediately. It was Dr. Osi. She thanked the firm. She talked about the initiative. She talked about the work they were funding and what it meant for kids in public schools who didn't otherwise have access to science materials or lab equipment. She was warm and precise, and everyone was listening. And then she said she wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the organization's leadership. She mentioned the executive director by name. She mentioned the board. And then she said, clearly and simply, that the partnership had been made possible in large part through the vision and relationship building of their director of corporate partnerships. She said June's full name. The room applauded. I watched my father's face. He had been half listening, the way you do when something is happening that you've decided doesn't concern you. And then he heard June's name and he looked up. He looked at the front of the room where Dr. Osi was gesturing toward our table. He looked at me. He looked at June. June stood up, briefly, graciously, the way she does everything. She smiled and nodded and sat back down. The applause continued for a moment. Then the program moved on. My father was very still. I leaned over to June. You knew, I said. I found out this afternoon, she said. They moved the announcement to tonight because of the dinner. I didn't know until today they were going to name me. Why didn't you tell me? She thought about that for a second. I didn't know how to tell you without it becoming about your father. I wanted you to just see it happen. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. My father came to our table about 15 minutes later. The rest of the room had resumed its noise. He pulled out the empty chair across from us and sat down. He looked at June for a long moment. I didn't know you were involved with that organization, he said. June nodded pleasantly. For about 4 years now. What exactly do you do there? She told him. Calmly, clearly, the same way she would tell anyone. She explained the scope of the partnerships, the funding model, the schools they worked with. She mentioned a few numbers, the grant totals, the number of students reached last year. My father listened. His expression was careful. He is a man who spent 40 years in a courtroom, and he knows how to listen without showing you what he's thinking. When she finished, he looked at me. I didn't realize, he said. I know, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the work you're doing in the classroom is connected, June said. She said it gently. Not as an accusation, just as a fact. The programs we fund go to schools like the one he teaches in. The equipment, the curriculum support. What he does every day is the whole reason the organization exists. My father nodded slowly. He looked like a man doing math he hadn't expected to have to do. I didn't think of it that way, he said. Most people don't, she said, at first. He didn't apologize that night. I want to be honest about that, because I think it would be easy to tell a version of this story where he stood up and made some grand statement and the room witnessed his reckoning. That's not what happened. What happened is smaller than that and maybe more real. He sat with us for about 20 minutes. He asked June questions about the nonprofit. Real questions, the kind that show you're actually processing what you've heard. At some point, he asked me which grade I taught, and when I told him 8th grade, he asked what the hardest part of that was. Not in the way he'd asked about the teaching earlier. The flat, conclusory tone of a subject already dismissed. He asked like he wanted to know. I told him. I told him about the kids who come in already convinced they're not science people, who've been told that or have told themselves that, and what it takes to get through to them. I told him about a student I'd had 2 years ago who failed my class first semester and ended up winning a regional competition by spring. He listened. He didn't say much, but he listened. When he got up to leave the table, he paused. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder, one of those gestures that is so small and so rare from certain people that it lands harder than a speech. Good, he said, that was all, but I knew what he meant. On the drive home, June was quiet for a while. The city lights were doing that thing they do when it's been raining, refracting off the wet streets, and I was watching them and not saying anything either. I hope that wasn't too much, she finally said. What do you mean? I didn't plan it. The timing was just, it happened. June, I said. It was perfect. She looked out the window. I just wanted him to see you, the way I see you. I didn't trust myself to say anything to that. I just drove. I've thought a lot about that evening since then. About what changed and what didn't. My father is still my father. He still leads with achievement and outcomes and the metrics of success that he spent a lifetime building his identity around. He probably always will. You don't undo 40 years over a dinner, even a dinner like that one, but something shifted. Something small and stubborn and real. A few weeks after the dinner, he called me. Not to talk to June, not for anything in particular, just called, asked how things were going. I told him about the science fair prep, about the 2 students who were entering the regional competition. He asked questions. He called them by the pronouns I used. He said, toward the end of the call, "That sounds like good work." 3 words, from my father, about my teaching. 3 words that took 30 years to arrive. I'm not going to pretend they fixed everything. They didn't. But they landed somewhere in me and they stayed. I've been a teacher long enough to know that the moments that matter rarely look the way you expect them to. You imagine the big reckoning, the clear turning point, the room that goes silent at exactly the right instant. Sometimes that happens. More often, it's a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. It's a hand on a shoulder. It's a question asked where before there were no questions. My wife sees me. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Not perfectly, not always, but in the deep way that matters. She sees what the work is, what it costs, what it means. And on a rainy evening in a restaurant with white tablecloths, without any plan, without any drama, she let someone else see it too. That's not nothing, that's everything actually.